Welcome to the Healthy Gut Podcast, the place where you can learn how to achieve a happy, healthy gut with your host, Rebecca Coombs. Welcome to episode 4 of the Healthy Gut Podcast. Today I am joined with Dr. Nirala Jacobi, and she is arguably Australia's leading Sibo specialist, and I'm so lucky to have her in the same country as me. Dr. Jacobi graduated from Bastyr University in 1998 with a doctorate in naturopathic medicine. And she's practiced as a primary care physician in Montana for 7 years before arriving in Australia. Lucky for us. And she's still a licensed physician in the US. She is a national and international speaker and also the creator of the Sibo Biphasic diet, which is what I use in my Sibo cookbooks. Dr. Jacobi is the medical director of Sibo Test, an online Sibo testing service, and also has a busy practice in northern New South Wales in Australia. So Dr. Jacobi and I today talk about testing and why we need to spend 3 hours doing the Sibo test. What I love about Dr. Nirala Jacobi's approach is that she talks a lot about how whilst you do need to follow protocols for the Sibo treatment, it's about taking a very individualised approach. I'm interested in the differences between methane and hydrogen dominant Sibo, and I know that many listeners see that they might have a methane dominant initial diagnosis, but then after some treatments that their hydrogen actually increases. So we talk about actually why and how that happens, along with the differences in the symptoms for hydrogen versus methane dominant Sibo. Also, Nirala has different treatment options depending on whether you are hydrogen or methane dominant, and she goes through the herbs that she uses for both of those dominant Sibo conditions. I ask her about die-off. Does it actually occur? Is it real? And she talks to me about what it is and how it occurs. There's another condition called SIFO, small intestinal fungal overgrowth, and we discuss, how does one actually test for that, and then what are the treatment options, and can you have Sibo and SIFO concurrently? Dr. Nirala Jacobi specialises in treating the more difficult patients, so the people that are reacting to everything, and often people that have been seeing another practitioner and they are kind of at their wit's end and they come to Dr. Jacobi because she is so experienced. So we talk around issues with histamine, oxalates, salicylates, why this happens, how she treats it, and most importantly, how you can prevent it from occurring. What are the flags or the symptoms that you should be looking for today to prevent yourself getting into that state? We go through the Sibo Biphasic diet. Now, this is the diet that I've used in my cookbooks and I myself followed when I was being treated for Sibo. So she talks about the phases of it and why she doesn't particularly or personally feed bacteria when she is treating her patients. So that's very interesting. And her end goal with her patients is to be off Sibo treatment. She does not want this to be a lifelong sentence. So the restricted diet and the treatment she believes should be temporary, although temporary may last for a few months for some people and a few years for other people. But ultimately, her objective is to get you back to health. And then we talk about things like probiotics, prebiotics, the migrating motor complex, which is such an important part of keeping yourself Sibo free. And she discusses what herbs she uses to support the migrating motor complex. And finally, a piece that I've just really resonated with was Dr. Nirala Jacobi talks about the importance of taking responsibility for your own health. I hope you enjoy episode 4 with Dr. Nirala Jacobi. Welcome to the show, Nirala.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's really great to be here.
Yeah, and just reading through your bio, like you are just so busy. You've got so much on.
This year, it seems to be, yes. There's a lot of SIBO related conferences and talks, and everybody seems to be very interested in the topic these days, which is great.
Which is wonderful. And being Australia's one of Australia's leading specialists on SIBO, there's no surprise that you are in high demand for your knowledge on all things SIBO. So I'd love to talk about your journey and how you ended up becoming Australia's leading specialist on SIBO. Like, what got you interested in it in the first place?
Well, that's a great question because, as a naturopathic doctor, we do focus on the gut as a primary target of treatment for not just digestive disorders, but for many different disorders. And so I've always had a great interest in treating the gut. And, one of the naturopathic tenets is that the gut is the root of the tree. And if you treat the root, then the tree can be healthy. So even when I practiced in Montana, I had just had a large practice of digestive difficult patients that would come in. And there was always a subset that this was before we really knew anything about SIBO. This was in the early 2000s, late 90s, that I really started to focus on digestive disorders. And this is before I knew SIBO. So I would treat dysbiosis and I would treat different digestive disorders and would get good results. But there was always a subset of patients that just did not respond to treatment, or they would have relapses. And it just didn't make sense to me. So when I went to the American Association of Naturopathic Physician Conference in 2011, this is something I go to every year. It's in America, obviously. And I listened to Dr. Seebecker and Dr. Steven Sandberg-Lewis give their first talk on SIBO to our naturopathic community. And I was just really completely dumbfounded that I'd never heard of this. And it answered so many questions for me of why some patients just do not respond to some of the very common products or dietary advice that we give to patients when they suffer from very certain digestive disorders. So that made a lot of sense for me. And then from then on, I was just hooked in terms of, wow, this is just like a brand new kid on the block, and I need to figure out everything there is to know about SIBO. And as the research extends, I'm just so thrilled to have this as a possibility, as an underlying cause for so many of my patients, because as I've mentioned, the gut is so related to so many different disorders. So I see people that have maybe their primary concern is they get frequent colds or flus, or they have an autoimmune disorder, and or they have joint pain, or they have mood disorders. And oftentimes SIBO links that all together. It's an underlying cause in so many different disorders. So that's very, very helpful. And the more you know about a condition, obviously, the more you start to really kind of see it in lots of different places.
Definitely. And so how do you how do you test your patients for SIBO when they turn up and present with symptoms that are common to SIBO? What do you do to commence that testing process?
Well, that was one of the reasons I started SiboTest.com, which is it's an online testing facility where practitioners can sign up, or patients can order the breath tests themselves. But the reason for that was really because the way I understood it and the way it was, the way I learned how to test for SIBO was different than what some of the breath tests were offering, labs were offering here. And so I just decided to do it exactly as Dr. Pimentel and the SIBO Center in Portland were doing it. And so I basically set up my own testing facility here in Australia and started to offer this service to other practitioners. So it's pretty easy for me now when I have a patient to just recommend SIBO testing. And we have a very quick turnaround time because of that, because we're right here. So that's very helpful. But basically, the testing assumes that you have bacteria in the first part of your small intestine where they're not meant to be. And bacteria that are there are fermenters. They ferment fibers. So if we prescribe a test to a patient, what they would do is basically have a day of a very restrictive diet to kill the bacteria a little bit. Then they fast overnight, and in the morning they would commence testing, which is drinking a test substance and then capturing samples of their breath every 20 minutes for 3 hours. And then when we analyze it, we can see where the hydrogen or the methane gas occurs in those samples. Now, hydrogen gas and methane gas are not produced by humans. They're produced by bacterial fermentation. And some of that is normal if it's in the large intestine. But if we capture it in the first 80 to 90 minutes of the person having drank the substrate, then we can be fairly sure that we've captured bacterial fermentation in the first part of the intestines.
And why does the test take 3 hours if you're looking at, say, the first 80 or 90 minutes?
That's a good question, because and that's really subject or up to debate in the scientific community. There are people that have very, very disrupted peristalsis or migrating motor complex in the small intestine, and so they will not their substrate will not reach in to the large intestine within 2 hours, right? So what we do is, again, we copy sort of what the Sibo Center does in Portland, and so they've extended it for 3 hours. Very often we see a rise much earlier than that, and classically we would expect a rise within the first 90 minutes is really what we're hoping to gauge. Now, methane is a little different because methane is produced by a different organism that's sort of not really a bacteria, but more of an ancient species that's been with humans for a long time. But what happens with methane producers is that they actually use the hydrogen from the hydrogen fermenters to produce methane. So we can see that pretty much throughout the digestive tract. And we're starting to think of methane producers a little bit differently, especially if we see that throughout the testing period and not just a rise in the first 90 minutes or so.
And is that why some people, when they have their initial test, they might be dominant with hydrogen, they go through some Sibo treatment, and then they retest, and their methane has increased? Is that why that methane can increase that once they're eating up hydrogen? Is that how it works?
It's actually kind of the other way around, but you're on the right track there. Okay. Yeah. So because if you're killing, like if we think that methanogens or organisms, which is basically Methanobrevibacter smithii, it's usually one species that produces methane. If they're present in the small intestine, and let's say you have a test result that reads as a high methane, but very, very low or single digit sort of hydrogen all throughout the test, and then you're treating for methane and you're retesting, and all of a sudden the methane is lower and the hydrogen is up, that's because you've killed the actual methanogens that would otherwise use the hydrogen to produce methane. So that's pretty common. So we do sort of see a bit of a waffling back and forth sometimes when we do retest, and you do want to retest if your patient, if you're a practitioner listening to this, or if you're a patient that's kind of educating your own practitioner, you want to kind of, you want to go through your treatment. And then if you're 80-90% better, you can just go on maintenance and use prokinetics, which we'll get into, I think, a little bit later. Or if you're not 80% better, you probably want to retest to ensure that you're actually making progress with methane or hydrogen reduction. Otherwise, you need to change your treatment.
That's so interesting. And are there symptoms, do the symptoms change depending on whether you've got hydrogen or methane dominance?
Well, classically what we see with methane dominant SIBO is constipation, and that we know also from research that if poor laboratory animals if their digestive tract is infused with methane gas, it is instantaneously constipating. So we do know that the gas itself is very disrupting to the normal movement of the large intestine as well. So, that's classically what we see. With hydrogen, you can see either constipation or diarrhea, or sort of a on and off, sometimes a day of or a couple day no bowel movement followed by a couple days of loose stools. And I think one of the reasons why we see really alternating patterns with hydrogen, but also sort of generally, I mean, I've had a few cases of methane that were dominant, that were not constipated. And we can't always just say it's just SIBO. This might just be that you have also fungal overgrowth in the small intestine or the large intestine. You might have as well an overgrowth of gram-negative bacteria in the large intestine. So typically when we see SIBO, that's very classically in the small intestine, but it's not resolving as quickly, you might want to consider doing a stool test to ensure that there isn't some other level of dysbiosis in the large intestine as well.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And so the treatment for hydrogen or methane, are they different? Do you treat them differently?
Yes, we can treat them differently. Sometimes what I do is I start with, I talk to practitioners that are on all sides of the spectrum. So I talk to GPs, I talk to naturopathic practitioners. So I have sort of my herbal treatments, and then you also have conventional treatments, which includes the use of antibiotics, some of which I really think are a great idea, and some of it I really don't endorse, or well, not so much endorse, but I don't see the need of it, because I think our herbs when you use them correctly, they work really, really well. So I don't like to use broad spectrum antibiotics or recommend the use of them, just because you can get into more problems down the road with fungal overgrowth, which you don't really get into with the herbs.
That's interesting.
Did you want me to go into like sort of specifics of treatment?
Yeah, I'd like to. Yeah? I think that would be handy for the listeners to understand, specifically how to do it.
Mm-hmm. First of all, I will say that the best results, and I can say this with really a lot of conviction in doing this for 5 years now, is work with a practitioner that's very well versed in the nuances of SIBO treatment. Because even though we have protocols, I really want to emphasize that I don't just follow protocols. I always individualize each treatment to each patient, because we are all different, and we have different needs, and we have different presentations. And even though my herbs may stay the same, I might rotate them more, or I might add other supportive nutrients, or I might treat something that may seem totally unrelated but is related. So I do encourage your listeners to seek out somebody that's that's had a lot of experience of SIBO treatment under their belt. On sibotest.com, there is a database of practitioners that we do endorse, that have done testing, that have done some further training, and that understand the complexity of SIBO treatment. So, but generally speaking, if you have a hydrogen dominant case, so meaning that your breath test comes back and within 90 minutes, and some practitioners extend that to 120 or even 3 hours. And this is, we're just a testing service, and we can recommend, but practitioners can interpret that as they see fit. So for hydrogen case, we often recommend berberine containing herbs, and that might be Oregon graperoot or philodendron or Berberis vulgaris. So there's a whole probably 6 or 7 herbs that we frequently recommend, and you need to go fairly strong with those herbs. And again, I can't really recommend or give you dosages, because it depends on where you get your herbs from and what complexes you use. Also, essential oils like oil of oregano and thyme oil, and those would be helpful, clove oil and cinnamon, etc. And what I like about those is that they also tend to be very effective in the treatment of SIFO, which is small intestine fungal overgrowth. And one small study showed that 63% of patients that tested positive for SIBO also have SIFO. So that's a pretty big number. And I often see people, when I treat my patients for SIBO, the people that respond the strongest to the killing phase, meaning the classic die-off symptoms, very often have have SIFO as a really strong component of their case. So berberine herbs are more for hydrogen. Very strong extract of garlic without the FODMAP component of garlic. I use often a product called Alimax for methane dominant, and you have to dose that fairly high, and you would do that for about 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. We can expect a drop in gases, and it's fairly predictable with methane. Each course of Alimax might drop at about 30 to 50 parts per million, and it's less predictable with the other herbs. So those are your two categories. I mean, we have a lot more in our arsenal when it comes to herbal medicine, but I'd say the berberine herbs are very classically used for hydrogen, and your garlic extract for methane.
You talked a little bit about die-off, and I have read online some great debate about whether die-off actually exists. Do you believe that there is such a thing as die-off, and that people do experience symptoms when the bacteria is dying off in their intestinal system?
Well, being a practitioner, I've been in practice for almost 20 years. I can pretty much get, in my experience, it's not even debatable whether or not it exists. It definitely it does exist, and some patients have it stronger than others, and I think there are reasons for that. So one of the components in a bacterial cell wall, especially particularly the gram-negative bacteria, which are quite prevalent in SIBO, is a substance called LPS, right? So LPS is just part of the bacteria. And when that bacteria dies and it releases LPS, and let's say you do have leaky gut as an underlying factor as well, then you're going to have more absorption of this it's one of the most strongest triggers of inflammation that we know. So people that have die-off can feel 48 hours or even longer quite flu-like, or brain fog, achy, quite sick. And so this is one of the reasons I've actually developed the biphasic diet, to minimize some of that. But, I've had people not have any reactions at all, and that might be because they don't have leaky gut. They just have SIBO, right? And SIBO is associated with permeability that is abnormal of the digestive tract, but not everyone has that. And then the other factor is, I do think that the die-off, or what we would more scientifically call the Herxheimer reaction, which is just, again, you're kind of reacting to the byproducts that are being released in the process of dying. So fungal elements tend to be sometimes stronger in their die-off provoking mechanism, in my experience.
And I think that leads nicely into SIFO, which is small intestine fungal overgrowth. Is there a way for that to be tested for?
Not really. We don't have any, we could test carbon dioxide, but we don't really, and there's no method to do that. Usually, candida or fungal elements, they do ferment as well, but they produce more carbon dioxide, and that's just very difficult to get an accurate measure in the way we measure with our breath trackers. And also, if we were to do, let's say, candida antibodies or stool tests, you're still not getting a clear picture as to where they're located. So I often do, this is the beauty of the natural protocol, because by definition, you're treating SIFO as well. You're doing it with diet and you're doing it with the herbs. So I like that approach because it's been really helpful for many, many of my patients.
And do you aim to treat one first over the other, or because it's a natural protocol, do you feel that you're getting both of them at the same time?
Well, the killing phase, is definitely both at the same time, because you're using herbs and essential oils and stuff that has effect for both. But then you have sort of like a rebalancing after I treat for SIBO and SIFO. I also start incorporating probiotics and other nutrients that help to stimulate the immune system and help to upregulate the intestinal mucosa immune system so that we start prevention as well. And that can be, it's not really specific to SIFO or SIBO. And this is where I start to really individualize for each of my patients, because not everyone needs that either. But I think that, like, let's say you're a conventional practitioner and you're only using rifaximin. Rifaximin is the antibiotic of choice for hydrogen dominant SIBO. It's very, very effective. And for methane dominant, it's not as effective. And so they often incorporate another antibiotic called neomycin, and some other practitioners use metronidazole or a plethora of other antibiotics, which can then kill off some of the other beneficial bacteria in the large intestine. And so breeding or laying the groundwork for breeding more fungal species, because if you eradicate beneficial bacteria that are meant to be there in the large intestine, that are keeping yeast in check or fungal elements in check, you are, it's very easy to get a fungal overgrowth. So a lot of practitioners and holistic or integrative GPs do a combination where they use rifaximin and use Alimax or use essential oils or oil of oregano to prevent some of this fungal overgrowth, or even use nystatin, which is a pretty common or prescription antifungal that's not too bad. It works pretty well as well.
And can you have SIFO without having SIBO? It sounds like the two commonly go hand in hand, but can you have the fungal overgrowth without the bacterial overgrowth?
I think you can. It's difficult to know that for sure from a scientific basis unless you do a small intestinal aspirate, which is just a sampling of the fluids in the small intestine. But we could reason through it, meaning that, let's say that you have somebody that's been on proton pump inhibitors for years, right? Proton pump inhibitors are probably one of the most commonly prescribed medicines in doctors' offices today, especially in America. This is an acid blocker. So acid blockers work by stopping the production of hydrochloric acid, which is your stomach acid. So if you do that for years on end, you create a real pH or acid-base balance in your small intestine. And fungal elements they just love a warm, moist environment, whether that's behind your fridge or inside of your gut, right? So if it's a moldy shower, that's warm and moist and dark, and the same thing in your gut. So they're just opportunistic infections that are in small amounts not harmful. But if you are overrun with fungal elements, then yes, it becomes a problem. So I could see a scenario where that happens, although the use of proton pump inhibitors has definitely been linked to an increase in SIBO. So I can't tell you whether or not I've ever treated someone who's just had SIFO, because I've just treated them and they got better. So I've sometimes treated people that had very classic symptoms of SIBO, but their test was negative. So either the test was just negative, because no test is always just positive. There's always some false negatives, or it required a different substrate to really pick up the bacteria, or it was just SIFO, So I'm still a naturopath where if I have somebody that presents with very classic symptoms and my treatment is harmless, I might just give a little trial to see how they respond. And if they respond, I carry on.
Yeah, great. And I guess it comes back to that individual approach where you're looking at the individual and what their own unique body requires, rather than taking a kind of carte blanche approach of, well, I'll try this on everybody and hope for the best.
Exactly, because, over the last, I'd say at least the last 2 to 3 years, I've seen some of the sickest patients I've ever seen in my life, because I specialize in SIBO, and people that have restricted themselves to 5 foods, right? They've completely painted themselves into a corner when it comes to foods, because the more you restrict, the more you react to everything that is put before you. So I had to really negotiate and navigate through reactions and kind of coaxing people back into more of a varied diet, and so it gets really tricky once you go down that road.
And you, from what I understand, you do see quite often some more challenging cases with patients that are that they're perhaps their own practitioner is finding it difficult or challenging to treat them and isn't sure why they're sick. So can you talk a little bit about the types of more difficult or challenging cases that you see commonly?
I'd say the most commonly referred patient would be one who reacts to everything that they're given, right? So whether that's herbs or certain foods, they become, so if we think about how that develops is, let's say they have Sibo and they started to, really look for answers, and they've looked through all the online stuff about paleo, and then it was bone broth, and then they became more sensitive to histamines, and then they became more sensitive to salicylates. So they're without really ever addressing the Sibo and the SIFO, they've just become more and more sensitized to foods. And what happens there is that we know with dysbiotic bacteria, actually, I'm not explaining that very well. Let me just back up. So foods have natural components, or especially plant foods have components in them that the plant uses to defend itself against invaders and pests and so forth. And these are, for example, histamines or oxalates, right? These are naturally found in green leafy vegetables. A lot of different vegetables have salicylates, and the most average person will never know any difference. Plant foods are very healthy for us. So, but when you become very overrun by either bad bacteria or fungus, you actually become more and more sensitive to these salicylates in particular. They're very, little spiky kind of or components that can actually do some damage in a very sensitized digestive tract. So I find the most challenge that I have is with people that are very reactive to histamine, which is it's normally found in certain even healthy foods like spinach. That's very high in foods that have been sitting around for a while, or cured meats or tinned fish, that kind of thing. So histamine, we know it can induce allergies, but in foods, it can cause a lot of other symptoms like bloating, like swelling, like itching, like insomnia. And so they start to react to that. Then they react to oxalates, which are also little tiny sort of crystal-like little substances in especially leafy green vegetables. And then next thing you know, they can only eat gluten-free bread and chicken, right? So it becomes very challenging. So they have now really selectively fed only a handful of bacteria in their large intestine. So what happens anytime you start to put in either herbs, most herbs are very high in salicylates, so these people will always react to the berberines and the alimax and everything else. And you also, can't really, like every time they introduce certain foods, they react. So those are the most challenging, I will tell you. And that just takes time and minuscule doses. And I use homeopathics, and I use desensitization, and I use a lot of different techniques to get these people at least out of what I call out of the basement, right? So get them on the first or second stair so that at least I can see the kitchen door. And then it takes a little while to turn these cases around sometimes.
And is there anything that people can do to help prevent themselves from ending up in that situation?
I'd say the big alarm bells that would go off for me is like you become more sensitive. You've restricted your food already. Next thing you know, you're starting to react to the food that you've restricted yourself to, right? That means you're becoming less diverse in your microbiome, which is what's meant to happen in your digestive tract. And there's this common misconception that you can just, let me actually back up. So we're talking about two different conditions. We're talking about SIBO, which is a condition of abnormal bacterial growth in an abnormal location. It's in the small intestine where there's not much action usually with bacteria. You are supposed to have trillions and trillions of bacteria in your large intestine that keep you healthy, that do a lot of different functions. And what we know about disease development, because what we now know from the Human Microbiome Project and the research that's coming out every day, is that the more diverse your microbiome is in your large intestine, the healthier you can be in general. So that's really the key. And the more you restrict your foods and the more you only eat foods that you don't react to, the more difficult it becomes with species diversity.
So really the flag for anybody listening to this podcast is if they're experiencing that restriction in foods that they can tolerate, they need to get onto it immediately. What would your advice be for them to do? Is it to go and find a practitioner that they can work with that will understand how to treat this?
Yeah, and look, I have to say that my learning curve as a practitioner was also very steep when I first, when I first learned about SIBO. I didn't really think about histamine and I didn't really think about salicylate. This was early days, and as my understanding broadened, the more I started to realize there's so much going on a mucosal level and microbiome level that we're affecting if we're also treating SIBO. So I had to just increase my understanding of it. I work with a nutritionist that has a good understanding of salicylates and food rotation and safe reintroductions and so forth. So I would definitely say work with somebody who understands the foods also, not just the protocol from a medicine perspective, but also understands how to negotiate around your food restrictions and how to safely reintroduce foods.
Definitely. I think that's great advice. And while we're on the subject of food, I'd love to talk about your Sibo Biphasic diet protocol. So tell me how that came about, how you developed that and why.
And we got a lot out of it, haven't we, Rebecca?
We have.
It's been such a journey, and I'm so grateful to you for having written such beautiful books based on that, because it just makes my life so much easier as a practitioner. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
So the way this came about was that and for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, it's a diet that's divided into two phases, as the name implies. And initially, it's been an evolution of the biphasic diet. But my frustration was that exactly what I just mentioned. I had patients that were very, very reactive, and I couldn't add the herbs in yet. So the diet is based on that when you first get diagnosed with SIBO, you start with phase 1. Now, phase 1 is further divided into two categories. One is strict and one is less strict. Let's just keep it there. And you start with your strictest approach, which is very much just protein and vegetables for all intents and purposes. That's what it is. And as soon as you improve, so this could be 3 days, could be 2 weeks, could be a month, then you move into the less restrictive part of phase 1. So that gives the practitioner an opportunity to not yet jump into treatment as far as antimicrobials, but more into gut balancers. And that could be digestive support in the form of enzymes or hydrochloric acid, or gut healers if they have a lot of reactions, like with salicylates. I would think about glycine or different kinds of nutrients that stabilize the mucosal membrane. And in terms of digestive support, I use a lot of herbal bitters, which are herbs that stimulate your own process of digestion. And so you have sort of a nice, elegant way of compartmentalizing your treatment without overwhelming your patient, because we've all seen it. People come in and they leave with 20 products, and that's not the kind of practitioner I aim to be. Sometimes it is intense and it has to happen, but only for a short period of time. That is not a long-term strategy to leave with tons and tons of products. So I usually like to do it in stages. And the first stage would be gut healing. And the second stage is more really going after the remaining bacteria and yeast. And so by the first phase, when you're restricting your diet, you are already, by definition, starving some of these organisms. And then when you going into the antimicrobial phase, which is phase 2, the diet opens up a little bit and you feel like you're in the land of the living again, and you're allowed certain nice foods like some grains and some fruit and perhaps some cheese. So life becomes a lot more tolerable at that point. And I find that to be very effective to have divided the treatment like that. And so it really came out of necessity for me, because just giving people a FODMAP diet just wasn't satisfying enough, because it often doesn't work. And also for how long are you supposed to do this? So it gave me really a lot more control over what am I actually monitoring and when should I retest. So it really is very helpful that way.
And there are several diets out there that people will commonly follow when it comes to SIBO treatment. Is this diet or protocol similar to any others?
It's similar, right? And the universal sort of approach I'd say that most diets have in common is the low fermentable fiber aspect to the diet. But how it's different is that it is divided into these two categories. The other aspect of that was, and this is somewhat open to discussion and some dispute, because Dr. Pimentel a couple of years ago at the Sibo Symposium mentioned that he basically tells people to eat anything that would feed a bacteria whilst he's giving them rifaximin. You know, in all good conscience, I'm a naturopathic doctor. I just can't do that because most of my people would flare up. So I just never have really, there were two reasons why I didn't want to do that. Number one, the risk of flaring people up with other underlying issues. And the other reason was that if they have SIFO, they would definitely get worse on that approach. And his idea was, okay, you need to feed the bacteria whilst you're killing them. Otherwise, they go into what's called senescence, and that's like a dormancy. And I really haven't seen that be very much a factor in my treatment. I still do before and after testing, and I get very good results. And so I decided not to do that. But that is one common, I'd say, argument out there is like, no, you should just eat potatoes and rice and sugar and all that just to feed the bacteria. And I would disagree with that approach.
And I think, again, it probably comes down to, the individual person as well. I know that when I started my SIBO treatment and went onto your protocol, I felt so much better by removing those foods that would have been feeding the bacteria. So I know for myself, I was really happy to be on your diet, even though it took a little bit of mental planning of figuring out what I was going to eat. But gosh, I felt the symptomatic improvement was worth it.
That's great to hear. And a lot of people tell that. You know, the thing is now my practice has really come to a point where I mostly see people that have already been treated. So these are the tough cases, right? So I yearn for the days where somebody is just very easily treated with just diet alone, you know, and I mean, it still happens, but the tough cases definitely outnumber the easy cases these days.
And those tough cases, gee, they need your help because they're generally feeling pretty unwell, I would imagine.
Yeah, they really do. People are very sick. They're very limited in just their enjoyment of life. And, that's food is part of the enjoyment of life. So I really feel for them.
Exactly. And it's one of the reasons why I put together the cookbooks was that I love cooking and I love sharing food with friends and family. And food is such a joyous experience as well as being our nourishment. And I wanted to remind people that even though we can be limited and some people are more limited than others, that there's still food, glorious food that we can enjoy while we're going through our SIBO treatment.
Right. That's right. And, the other important point to that, though, is that there should be an end to treatment at some point, right? Is that let me rephrase that. There are some cases of SIBO where relapse is so common because there is a damage to this migrating motor complex, which is the normal motion in the small intestine that propels all content of the small intestine towards the large intestine. So that's the normal cleansing wave. When that's damaged from a past case of food poisoning or gastroenteritis, then it's very difficult because patients have to be on a maintenance diet. But the fact is that when you restrict fibers that are fermentable from the large intestine or from the microbiome that lives in the large intestine, you are going to, they're not going to be happy either. Don't have anything to eat then. So I always endeavor to tell patients, look, even though this might take us some time, there is an end in sight, or at least my goal for you is that there is a time where you can open up your diet and you can enjoy certain foods that you are restricting right now because they're still healthy foods.
I think that's great advice. It's not a life sentence.
I hope not. I hope not. Sometimes it sure seems that way for people, but sometimes it's also relative, right? What you and I would think of just a perfectly healthy diet is like a complete life changer for other people who are eating processed foods. And I mean, I barely see people like that anymore. But back when I lived in Montana, saw people that ate the standard American diet. And so even if you just removed sugar, they felt like $1,000,000, after 2 weeks. So there's like a relative scale to what we would consider food restrictions in our vocabulary, I think.
Yeah, that's so true. We've talked a bit about this migrating motor complex and the cleansing wave through the intestinal system. Are there things that you can take that help support that wave?
Yeah, and that's the migrating motor complex is part of the normal nervous system in your small intestine that ensures that you don't get SIBO just by eating bacteria in food. So normally bacteria that are on food are supposed to be killed by the hydrochloric acid and by bile and by digestive enzymes. And when some of that is disrupted, you can develop SIBO. But more sinister, when you've had a case of gastroenteritis, like a really severe case of food poisoning that you remember and you've never been well since, that's very indicative of having developed SIBO as a result of damage to this particular cleansing wave. And that has to happen. That occurs because of basically an autoimmune response where the body mistakenly attacks something called vinculin, which is part of the migrating motor complex, instead of the toxin that the bacteria releases of the food poisoning. So in essence, it damages your cleansing wave, and so you can't adequately flush out the remaining bacteria after you've eaten something. So if that's the case, then we use medicines or herbs called prokinetics. And prokinetics basically just means they are promoting the forward motion of the small intestine. So, I wish I could say I have foolproof herbs that work every time. Like, for example, with Alimax, I'd say more than 90% of the time it works for methane. But I don't have something like that for prokinetics, and neither does conventional medicine. It's really an area that needs more research. I have a lot of tools in my tool belt, but it doesn't work for everyone. So something will work 50% of the time. Then I have to try something else. But generally speaking, if I had something that was foolproof for everyone, it's not even sure that everyone would need it, because not everyone has SIBO because of food poisoning, right? So, and it's really only those that need to reset their migrating motor complex that require long-term use of prokinetics. But typically, my protocol does include herbal prokinetics, which could be ginger. We also use acetyl L-carnitine, which is just a nutrient, which is a component of some of the neurotransmitters that are involved in peristaltic movement. I use also a combination of herbs that just stimulate the upper gut generally. There's also a product called Iberogast, which is pretty easy to find over the counter, which has some promise. I don't see it working every time. There's some thoughts on melatonin. There's some thoughts on limonene. So there's lots of discussion in the SIBO community, and we don't really have a consensus yet. So there are things that we will try, and sometimes it's also probiotics that seem to be helpful. So there's not one size fits all.
And on the subject of probiotics, should everybody have probiotics, or is it again an individual case? And when would you use a probiotic in treatment? There's a lot of discussion on the online forums about probiotics. I'd love your thoughts on them.
So the common misconception that I find around the subject of probiotics is that they will replace what you've lost in the large intestine. And that's just simply not true. If I were to take a sample of stool from the average person, the vast majority of bacteria would not be the bacteria that we find in probiotics, right? That's just a tiny sliver, and that's just because we haven't studied everything yet. So we don't have much in terms of being able to supplement with certain probiotics. So, but what we do know about probiotics is that they're really pretty powerful. So this is, Lactobacillus species, Bifidobacterium species are very what we call biological response modifiers, or they modulate your immune response. And so I often use certain strains like Lactobacillus plantarum, Paracasei, those kinds of strains, if I see a lot of inflammation, for example. If I see a lot of large intestinal issue, I tend to favor more the Bifidobacterium species. So it gets really individualized with the types of. I have probably in my fridge in my clinic probably 10 to 12 different probiotics right now, or complexes, different products, and I'm playing around with different spores and things like that. Not playing, I'm experimenting, but so it is a lot more individualized. But the take-home message is that we do know that through research, that they've been studied actually a lot in IBS, and SIBO is just a subset of IBS. So we will see certain aspects or certain strains be really helpful in certain symptoms. So for example, with cramping or with constipation or certain symptoms associated with SIBO, but I have not seen any data that conclusively tells me that using probiotics is a treatment for SIBO.
That's very interesting. And I've also read a lot about prebiotics, so the food that you take or foods that you take before probiotics. Do you use prebiotics in your treatment?
Yeah, so prebiotics are actually not things that you take before taking probiotics. They're food for probiotics, okay. Right? So prebiotics, like it used to be FOS or fructooligosaccharides and inulin, and that's still used in a lot of probiotic formulas. Those prebiotics are put into those formulas to ensure that those organisms actually survive, right? So the way it normally works is you're supposed to have a wide variety of species in your digestive tract that ferment your fibers. That's a natural process that's meant to happen in your large intestine. And fermenting those fibers frees something called short chain fatty acids. And those are prebiotics. They're all food for your normally occurring bacteria there. So using prebiotics has been very controversial in the treatment of SIBO because we don't want to feed the bacteria that are in the wrong location. And there definitely is, I think that's a really valid argument. There is some thought, and this is actually an area where Dr. Jason Horolak would, I think he's a wealth of knowledge in this regard, and he's one of the speakers at the Sibo Summit in Melbourne and Sydney in October. And he will be talking exclusively about probiotics and prebiotics. And I think there'll be a lot of myth busting going on at the time. So I'm looking forward to that. But I do use very selective prebiotics under certain circumstances. So I don't use probiotics that contain prebiotics in my active treatment. I basically, during the active phase of my treatment, I don't recommend using probiotic compounds that contain prebiotics for the simple reason you don't really want to promote the growth of those organisms. So I think there is a place for them afterwards, but I like to target them with more specific prebiotic substances such as galacto-oligosaccharide, which is a very specific prebiotic that's targeting bifidobacterium. So there are very specific prebiotics that do certain roles. They don't just universally feed everything. So that's where I think the movement will be more towards, or the research will go more towards that, rather than just using compounds that contain all sorts of prebiotics.
And what's your view in terms of the future of SIBO? Where do you think we're going to go with this condition? Because it's still relatively unknown in Australia. It has a greater awareness in the States, but relatively speaking, not many people know about it. What's your view on the future?
Well, one of the real gratifying events that's sort of taken place in my years of practice is this massive research that's going on into the microbiome. And I would, think of SIBO, one of the reasons it's got so much airtime is because it's part of that continuum and that spectrum. So what's happened is more and more focus on digestive disorders and the real important role that bacteria play in our health and in disease as far as the digestive tract is concerned. The other aspect of that is that if you've been diagnosed with SIBO, that's not the end. That's just the beginning, because ideally you want to find out what's caused SIBO, because that's how you really become SIBO free, is when you treat the underlying cause of SIBO. And that could be, some people never find out if it was because of food poisoning, but it could be because of adhesions, which is scar tissue that's built up in the abdominal cavity due to surgery, removal of the appendix or the gallbladder. So you can have scar tissue that just builds up inside inside your abdomen that causes structural abnormalities of your digestive tract. Or it could be because of medication, or because you have very high levels of stress. So I would invite your listeners to think about SIBO is caused by something. So continue to examine what is going on in your lifestyle that may have contributed to it.
That leads me nicely onto my final point, which is around when I started this journey to health, I realized there were 5 key areas that I needed to address: awareness, nutrition, movement, mindset, and lifestyle. I'd love your thoughts, Nirala, on those 5 key areas. And if you think there are any others that we should be focusing on when we're looking at our own journey to health.
Well, I'd actually like to hear from you how you would classify those categories, because I have my interpretation of those categories, and it would be nice to hear how you would summarize them in a few seconds.
Sure. For me, awareness was around actually reconnecting with my body. So listening to my body, really taking note of what it was saying, and not hiding or masking any of the symptoms with over-the-counter or prescription pharmaceuticals like I had for many years. My nutrition, whilst I was pretty healthy in terms of what I ate, it wasn't necessarily the right nutrition for me at that point in time. And likewise, as I healed and recovered from SIBO, I needed to readdress my nutrition to support a healthy microbiome. My movement, I had been pretty sluggish. I'd been sick for such a long time that I really wasn't getting out and moving my body. And that for me wasn't necessarily about going and pumping weights at the gym. It was around just moving, like getting out, going for a walk. And again, that helped with the awareness because I was able to reconnect with how my body felt. And the mindset piece was pretty important to me because I realized I was in a negative state. When you feel sick for a long time, you can often focus on all the negative things that are happening in your life rather than the positive things. So I had to start really actively focusing on positives, and to start with, they were small. It was the sun shining today. Hooray.
I think that's beautiful. I think that encapsulates it pretty well. I would add to that probably responsibility, right? Taking ownership and responsibility of your body, which means that even though, I think we've been trained to some extent in Western medicine to abdicate our responsibility, that we go to the doctor to get one pill for our headache and another for this and another for that. So to really kind of take stock of how you've contributed to the development of whatever happened in your life, whether that's your health issues or relationship issues or however, I think we need to really start being more responsible and active participants in all these aspects. And doesn't mean that we have to blame the victim, but it's more to say, you know what, yeah, maybe I really, this time I'm really going to change my diet to reflect really those values and those approaches I want to take in my life. So I think that's really well put. I do think that obviously in my profession, I do see people that have done already a lot of that. And certainly people that have advanced cases have examined a lot of that. I'd also consider, oftentimes I talk about emotional aspects or people that are ruminators, right? People that are just sort of they think they've given up or they think they have processed a certain event in their life and they really haven't. And that is contributing to their levels of stress in their body or their depression or their reaching for unhealthy foods. So really examining all parts of your life if you have a chronic illness, I think is paramount, because that is how you get true and lasting health benefits, not just on a physical level, but really on an emotional and spiritual level.
That's so true. Thank you for that wonderful advice. Nirala, it's been fantastic having you on the Healthy Gut podcast today. I have really thoroughly enjoyed it. I've also learnt a lot. Every time I think I know something, I learn more about it, which is just wonderful. How can people find you if they'd like to learn more about you, your diet protocol, or your testing facility? How can they find you?
I have my personal website is niralajacobi.com. This is my practice where I see patients. And so that's niralajacobi.com. But to find out more about Sibo and how to get tested for it, and also do a free quiz or direct your practitioner to maybe sign up to get more educated about it, you can go to sibotest.com. That's SIBOTEST.com. And there's a lot of information there. And I do regular webinars and regular practitioner education seminars. There's also, as I've mentioned before, the Sibo Summit. And I know you'll be there, Rebecca. So hopefully everyone listening can join us there and meet you in person and meet us in person. That'll be in Sydney on October 10th and in Melbourne on October 8th. That's a whole day-long in-person intensive, primarily for practitioners, and really sort of a crash course in how to treat Sibo. And we've got Dr. Alison Seebecker flying over all the way from Portland, Oregon to join us. We've got Dr. Jason Horlak, as I've mentioned, who's really an expert in pre and probiotic use. Myself and other guest speaker. We've got Alyssa Tate, who is a phenomenal physical therapist, talking about adhesions and sort of the structural components of Sibo. And we have other guest practitioners sharing their case studies with us. So it'll be a really, really wonderful day of everything you ever wanted to know about Sibo, but we're afraid to ask kind of a day.
And I think what's really exciting about the Sibo Summit is that it is Australia's first Sibo event. So it's going to be a really great landmark event here in Australia to teach practitioners everything, like you say, everything they need to know about Sibo. Well, Nirala, thanks so much for your time today, and I'm sure my listeners have gleaned so much information from you from the show. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here, so thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.
I hope you enjoyed episode 4 of the Healthy Gut podcast with Dr. Nirala Jacobi. If you would like to access the show notes from today's episode, head to thehealthygut.co/herbal treatments. Now, because I love my listeners of the Healthy Gut podcast, I've got something special for you there as well. You can download a complimentary copy of my Sibo Breakfast e-cookbook, which follows Dr. Nirala Jacobi's Biphasic diet protocol. And it's full of really delicious breakfast recipes that you can enjoy whilst treating Sibo. If you've enjoyed today's episode, I'd love for you to leave me a rating and review in iTunes. And don't forget to tell your friends about the podcast. I also love connecting with you on social media platforms. So you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, and YouTube. So make sure you head over there and join us at The Healthy Gut. Coming up in episode 5, I interview my lifesaver. I have found the most incredible naturopath here in Melbourne, Australia, whose name is Natalie Cruttenden. Natalie has over 20 years clinical experience and, in my mind, is one of Melbourne's best naturopaths when it comes to gut health, with a particular focus on Sibo. So we talk about how she approaches Sibo treatment, what she commonly sees in her clinic, and also why she has such a good success rate. There's people like myself that get treated by Natalie, and we do really well. So I look forward to seeing you at episode 5 of the Healthy Gut podcast. You've been listening to the Healthy Gut Podcast with Rebecca Coombs. To learn more about the Healthy Gut or the podcast, head to thehealthygut.co/podcast. If you would like to help support the continuation of this podcast, you can make a contribution at thehealthygut.co/podcast. With thanks to Julian Pryor from J Podcaster for the production and editing of this podcast. To learn more, head to jpodcaster.com. We would also like to thank Belinda Coombs for the original music score. To hear more of Belinda's music, head to soundcloud.com/Belinda Coombs. The Healthy Gut Podcast is a production of The Healthy Gut.